One contention often made by those who oppose William Henry Roberts' claim to being Billy the Kid is that there were no reported sightings of Billy the Kid after he was reportedly killed by Pat Garrett in 1881. In the book, alias Billy the Kid by William V. Morrison and C.L. Sanderson, it contains the following statement by Pat Garrett's son, Oscar Garrett, who stated, quote, "To believe Brushy Bill is to question the veracity not merely of my father, but of a whole generation. For if Billy was not killed, practically everybody in southern New Mexico must have heard something about it and must have been an accessory to a lie by keeping silent." End quote. But who's to say everybody did remain silent? Throughout the years following the reported death of Billy the Kid, there were many reported sightings and accounts of the kid. There were also several relevant anecdotal incidents involving the kid after his reported death. Some of these accounts specifically link Billy the Kid as being Brushy Bill Roberts. What follows are some of these documented accounts. In the book, Whatever Happened to Billy the Kid, by Helen Airy, it contains the 1935 account of Arlie Nation, who interviewed Miss Sid Boynton of Lincoln, New Mexico, who stated that Billy the Kid, quote, "stayed at her home in Lincoln many times after he was supposed to have been dead." End quote. Nation also interviewed a man by the name of Trujillo, who died in 1935 at the age of 95, who stated that the man killed by Garrett resembled an Indian and most definitely was not Billy the Kid. In the book, The Kid, Billy the Kid, by Bill Rackesee, it contains the Workers' Progress Administration article by Linda Sanchez, titled Recuerdos de Billy the Kid. According to Linda Sanchez, quote, "Eno Salazar, who everyone said was as close to Billy as anyone, rarely talked about his relationship to the kid. Until his own death, he stated that the kid's murder was a hoax. He also claimed to have received a letter from Billy telling him what happened and that he did not die, that it was all lies. In the early 1950s, a patient in the hospital in Socorro also mentioned this letter to another resident from Lincoln. How he knew about it, no one knows, but the people were surprised that it was remembered, because Eno had died years before. This aspect has been and will probably continue to be shrouded in mystery. It is possible that an itinerant sheepherder could have been killed instead. As with many famous lawmen, Pat Garrett did not always have an impeccable reputation, though many of his supporters state that the kid was definitely killed that night. The fact that Eno talked very little about their exploits and adventures could indicate he was trying to protect his friend and that he believed the kid was alive up to the time of his own death. Many Hispanos believe he escaped." End quote. In a May 4, 1933 El Paso Herald-Post article, Wilbur Smith of Fort Stanton, New Mexico, interviewed Eno Salazar, who made the following statement regarding whether or not the kid was still alive. Quote, "I would not be surprised to see him return to his old battlegrounds." End quote. In the book, Billy the Kid, Killed in New Mexico, Died in Texas, by Dr. Janae Valdez and Judge Bob Hefner, it contains the following, which grants further credence to the claim that Salazar believed that Billy survived. According to a February 19, 1990, notarized affidavit of Mr. James V. Tolley, the nephew of Frank Coe, who wrote that Eno Salazar believed that Billy wasn't killed by Garrett, stating, quote, "Salazar learned that Billy the Kid escaped to Mexico, and his friend was the one killed in Fort Sumner. That when Salazar was on his deathbed, as his last rites were spoken, he confessed to the death of Pat Garrett." This affiant further states he learned of this tragedy from none other than Joe Salazar, grandson of Eno Salazar. That Joe stated it was high time that this error was revealed to the public and a mystery cleared up, as no one knew who killed Pat Garrett. This affiant further states that Joe Salazar was present when Brushy Bill visited the Salazar home in 1950, that upon entering the living room, Brushy Bill strode across the room and embraced a large photograph of Eno Salazar on the wall, that Joe said, when he did with tears in his eyes, that he, Joe Salazar, knew full well that Brushy Bill was Billy the Kid. End quote. In the book, Whatever Happened to Billy the Kid, by Helen Airy, it contains the account of Ann Storer, of Belen, New Mexico, which states, quote, "My father, Charlie Walker, grew up around Fort Sumner during the early 1900s. A Mexican he used to work for told him that he saw Billy the Kid at the bullfights in Mexico long after he was supposed to be dead." End quote. In the November 10, 1937 El Paso Times, it contains the following report. Ben Harbert of Taos, New Mexico, a businessman, said Tuesday night he saw the young desperado on the streets of Taos after Pat Garrett shot the kid at the old Pete Maxwell ranch house at Fort Sumner, New Mexico, on July 14, 1881. Mr. Harbert stated, quote, "I knew Billy, and I am convinced it was he." End quote. According to researcher and author Helen Airy, quote, "The story that Billy the Kid was not killed by Pat Garrett was not a surprise to old-timers around Lincoln, many of whom never conceded the kid's death. Frank Coe, a friend of Billy the Kid's during the Lincoln County War, believed to the day of his death that Billy was still alive, and spent a great deal of time tracing reports that he had been seen." End quote. On June 25, 1950, William V. Morrison interviewed Helena Coe LeMay, the daughter of former Lincoln County regulator and friend of Billy the Kid, Frank Coe, at Navajo Lodge, Ruidoso, New Mexico, during which she stated that her father always believed that Billy the Kid survived his reported demise in 1881. He always investigated reported sightings of the kid. She recounted one occasion stating, quote, "Once he heard that his old friend was living in California. He took the family with him and went out to see about it. He left us in the car while he paid a visit to the claimant, who was living in a shack on the outskirts of a California town. He came back disappointed, and with tears in his eyes, saying that man was an imposter." End quote. Frank Coe's belief that Billy the Kid wasn't killed by Pat Garrett in 1881 was granted further credence by Frank Coe's daughter in an October 20, 1952 letter from William V. Morrison to attorney W.T. Moyers. He writes, quote, "I spent last week in New Mexico at the Bunnell Ranch in Glencoe. Mrs. Bunnell voiced the opinion that our man was Billy the Kid." End quote. John B. Squire Wilson was a friend of Billy the Kid and served as a go-between between Billy and Governor Lew Wallace in setting up their eventual meeting and agreement for securing Billy a pardon in exchange for his testimony against Colonel Dudley and those who killed Houston Chapman. He didn't believe Garrett killed the kid. According to Wilson's son George, who once worked for John W. Poe, in a letter dated August 7, 1950, from William V. Morrison to George Wilson, it states, quote, "I was delighted to be able to talk to you, since your father, Judge Wilson, was a very good friend of Billy the Kid. It was interesting to know that you did not think that Garrett killed Billy. Also, while you were working for Mr. John Poe, he told you that he told Garrett he killed the wrong man, and that the kid was still outside in the yard." End quote. In the September 8, 1990 edition of the Albuquerque Journal, it contains an interview by Arlie Sanchez, who interviewed Miss Nadine Brady, a granddaughter of the late William Brady. Sanchez recorded the following, quote, "Nadine says one old-timer told her Garrett didn't shoot Bonnie. He told her Garrett and Bonnie were good friends, and Garrett invented a story to help his friend escape. A wanderer was killed and buried, and Garrett told everyone he had shot Billy the Kid." End quote. In the August 3, 1950 edition of the Daily Argus newspaper, it told of another interesting account, that in 1950, Mrs. Iva Driver of Carlsbad, New Mexico, stated that her father, Jesse Cox, used to bring wagon trains through Eddy County, and had a ranch in the Sacramento Mountains near Cloudcroft. Cox Canyon was named after her father, who had arrived in New Mexico in 1877 and was well acquainted with Billy the Kid. She stated that Billy often accompanied her father on wagon train trips and cattle drives in the fall and spring seasons. She claimed that she had seen and spoken to Billy the Kid on numerous occasions after he was reportedly shot and killed by Sheriff Pat Garrett on July 14, 1881. In a letter dated October 10, 1949, from John J. Clancy to William V. Morrison, it states, quote, "In passing, I might say that in the 1930s there arose a big controversy over whether the kid had really been killed by Garrett or not. Some fellow up and said he had seen the kid somewhere in California, running some kind of restaurant. Another said he had seen him in Old Mexico. Somebody over in Mora County, a close Anglo-American friend of the kid's, claimed he had seen the kid a couple of weeks after he was alleged to have been killed over in his country. Then the late Jim Abercrombie, daring adventurer in his own right, late pioneer merchant of Anton Chico, New Mexico, claimed he had seen the kid and had been with him after his alleged taking hence at Fort Sumner, New Mexico, by Pat Garrett. This summer, when I was at Santa Rosa, New Mexico, a telegraph operator named Thomas told me casually he knew the kid and confirmed quite well what I had already heard about him." End quote. In the book, New Mexicans in Cameo and Camera, New Deal Documentation of 20th Century Lives, edited by Marta Weigel, it contains the August 26, 1936 interview conducted by Federal Writers Project researcher Janet Smith with Jose Garcia y Trujillo of Albuquerque, New Mexico, which states that, quote, "Jose Garcia y Trujillo does not believe that Billy the Kid was ever shot. He feels sure he got away to South America. He wouldn't be surprised if he is alive somewhere today. An old man with many memories and a quick mind like himself. When I showed him a book by the man who killed Billy the Kid, Pat Garrett, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, noted desperado of the Southwest, he was unconvinced. No, senora, and he shook his forefinger back and forth before his face. You think Billy the Kid let himself be shot in the dark like that? No, senora. Billy the Kid, never. I see Billy the Kid with these eyes, many times with these eyes. That Billy, he had an agility in his mind here. He pointed to his forehead. Garcia claimed to have been a member of a posse that pursued Billy, but that he and the other Mexicans liked Billy and didn't really want to kill or capture him, stating that Billy the Kid, a very generous man. All the Mexican people, they like him. He give money, horses, drinks, and what he have. To whom was good to Billy the Kid, he was good to them. Always very polite, very much of a gentleman. Once, lots of men, they go together after Billy the Kid to shoot him. They pay us. We go, sure, but we don't want to shoot Billy. We always be glad he too smart for us." End quote. In the book, alias Billy the Kid, by William V. Morrison and C.L. Sonnichsen, it cites a letter dated February 5, 1955, from Mrs. Paul Bates, granddaughter of J.H. Wood of Elk, New Mexico, to William B. Morrison. According to Mrs. J.H. Wood, whose husband was a rancher and blacksmith at Seven Rivers, New Mexico, she maintained until her dying day that Billy the Kid ate dinner at her house 3 days after he was supposed to have been killed. In the book, The Return of the Outlaw Billy the Kid, by W.C. Jameson and Frederick Bean, it cites a letter dated March 26, 1983, from Paul Kane of Victoria, Texas, to Mrs. Ola M. Everhard of Lovington, New Mexico. Mr. Kane stated that, quote, he had met one of Pat Garrett's daughters in Roswell, New Mexico. Though blind, the daughter taught piano to youngsters. The daughter told Kane that her dad did not kill Billy the Kid, as they were good friends. End quote. This daughter was Elizabeth Garrett. In the book, alias Billy the Kid, by William V. Morrison and C.L. Sonnichsen, it cites a letter dated November 29, 1950, from Mrs. W. W. Carson to William V. Morrison. It states, quote, I lived in the Penasco County for 2 years, from October 1887 to October 1889. It was rumored that Billy was hiding in the mountains there. In the spring of 88 or 89, I was returning to my school on Lower Penasco, riding horseback. Couldn't get my pony to get into the water to cross the river. After quite a while of useless attempts, a young man suddenly appeared from nowhere and asked if he could assist me. He led the horse or pony across the wide expanse of that river. When I described him to many of the old-timers, they all said it was Billy the Kid. He was supposed to have been dead a few years previous, but those in the Penasco region did not believe him to be dead. I recalled that he was very kind to a young, scared girl schoolteacher and was a perfect gentleman. End quote. In the book, They Knew Billy the Kid, by Robert F. Cadlick, it recounts that in November 1938, while working under the Federal Writers Project, Drury D. Sharp interviewed a man identified simply as Mr. Poe, a cousin of John W. Poe, who did not believe that Billy the Kid was shot and killed by Pat Garrett. The following is taken from that interview. Quote, Mr. Poe first met Billy the Kid in 1879 or 1880, or thereabouts, when he was trail driving cattle from Coleman County, Texas, to McSween's ranch near Lincoln, New Mexico. Billy the Kid was riding for McSween at the time, and when Mr. Poe and his riders approached McSween's range, Billy, Bill Kellum, Cherokee Bill, Frank Coe, and a rider named Guggen were sent by McSween to escort the cattle in. Mr. Poe says that he doubts very much if Pat Garrett really killed Billy the Kid. For one thing, he says that Frank Coe told him 6 or 8 years ago that he could saddle his horse at sunrise at his ranch on the Rio Doso near the resort there and eat supper with the kid at sundown. Another thing that leads him to believe that the kid was not killed, then, is the story that Pat Garrett told of the killing. Mr. Poe's cousin, John Poe, was deputy sheriff under Pat Garrett. John Poe and a cattle association man, Thomas McKinney, Mr. Poe says, were sitting outside Pete Maxwell's room when Billy the Kid came along with a butcher knife to cut a piece of meat. They had just butchered a beef. Poe said he ran right into them, and the kid pulled his pistol and said, "Kness, kness," for he couldn't see them very well. Poe answered, "Don't get scared, my man, don't get scared. We're friends." And Billy demanded again, "Kness, kness," as he backed into the room where Maxwell and Pat Garrett was on the bed and shot the kid as he came to the door. Mr. Poe says that a man like the kid, with a price on his life, would never have asked "Kness," but would have killed the two without question. Another thing he states is that nobody was allowed to see the remains of the man that was shot except Pete Maxwell and family, Pat Garrett, John Poe, Thomas McKinney, and an old Mexican woman. He mentions Perry Carney, who was the right hand of Pat Coughlin, Cattle King, who lived in Tularosa, and the little Irishman worked for him and received the stolen cattle the kid brought. Perry Carney told me, and 2 Mexicans told me, the kid positively was not killed. Carney told me the kid came over and got a saddle after Pat Garrett was supposed to have killed him. End quote. In a letter dated January 25, 1952, from William B. Morrison to W. T. Moyers, it states, quote, George W. Coe told George F. Cole of El Paso that he had seen the kid recently and that he had visited with the kid in Mexico. Mr. Cole loaned money to the kid in 1950 with which to make a trip to Albuquerque. End quote. In the book Whatever Happened to Billy the Kid by Helen Airy, it cites several sightings of Billy the Kid that were published in various newspaper articles. For instance, during the 1920s and 1930s alone, there were several reported incidents involving Billy the Kid that were reported in the El Paso Herald-Post, El Paso Herald-Times, and El Paso Times newspapers. In the 1926 El Paso Herald-Post article, it reads, quote, Billy the Kid, the legendary hero of the Southwest, is the subject of a recent controversy that is interesting all New Mexico. Although he was supposedly shot by Sheriff Pat Garrett over 40 years ago and buried in Fort Sumner, and a discussion before the New Mexico Historical Society a few days ago, an El Paso man who withheld his name sent the statement to the society that the kid was still alive. He knew an old-timer who had brought the kid from Texas to New Mexico and who assisted in his escape. The El Paso man met the kid in 1916 in the company of this old friend. A corroboration of the story is told by Manuel Taylor, an old prospector who used to run races with the kid in Silver City and once pried the bars off the chimney top of the old adobe jail so Billy could climb out. Taylor says he met the kid in Guadalajara, Mexico in 1914, and they had a few drinks together. He said the kid had married there and had a family. End quote. In the June 29, 1926 El Paso Times-Herald, it reads, quote, Billy the Kid is alive and resides within a radius of 200 miles of El Paso. He has been in El Paso within the last 10 years and will probably return within the next few months if a government official here is correct in this statement. One other person, a friend of Billy, is living in El Paso, who said he was present on the night of 1881 when Billy is supposed to have been killed by Pat Garrett, who was then sheriff of Lincoln County, New Mexico. When Billy rode away on the county clerk's black mare after killing his 2 guards, he rode straight to the home of his sweetheart, Paulita Maxwell, who lived in Fort Sumner. The friend said Garrett was Billy's best friend, and therein hangs the tales as told by the friend and the government official who declares Billy is living under an assumed name near El Paso. Billy and his friend Garrett framed an escape, the official says. The sheriff had to be away from town that day, and he told the guards to watch Billy and not let him escape. Billy escaped, and it was up to Pat Garrett to go get him. There was a $5,000 reward offered to the captor. Billy was under sentence to hang and wanted to escape. The little black mare was swift, and Billy easily outdistanced his pursuers. He stayed at the home of his sweetheart that night. Garrett, by prearrangement, went to Paulita's house, the friend said. This is what Billy's friend says what took place that night. Billy, here's $1,000. Take it and get out of the country as fast as you can. Garrett told Billy, we will fake a killing and bury someone here tonight so that folks will think I have killed you. Pat, I don't need that much money. I will take $25 if you have it. That will be enough to get me far away, Billy told him. Billy, I want your solemn promise that you will not carry a gun for 20 years, Garrett said. I promise, was Billy's answer. Both men shook hands over the promise, and Billy got on the little black mare and rode into the night. He is said to have ridden to a man he could trust, a rancher who would keep his mouth shut and help him. That rancher is still alive and living in El Paso. It is he who tells of the events on that night. When Garrett saw Billy vanish into the night, he rushed to the house, fired 2 shots, and with a man who helped him rushed a supposed body from the house before Paulita or any of her family could see it. The body was taken to a grave already prepared to receive it without the form of a ceremony. That grave was marked by a rude cross. That was to prove to Billy's sister that he was still alive. The rancher declared last night that the grave has been dug into during the past 2 years and there are no bones in it. It was merely a fake mound of dirt with a fake corpse, he said. Paulita discovered in 1912 that Billy was still alive, but she had been married for years to a Mexican and time had healed the wounds caused by Billy's fake death. End quote. In a June 22, 1926 El Paso Herald-Post article it states, quote, New Mexico Historical Society has received word from an El Pasoan whose name it has not revealed, but is said to be a person of prominence, that Billy the Kid is still alive. It is alleged that Billy, not having been slain at Socorro by Sheriff Pat Garrett, is still alive in some unmentioned place, and the El Pasoan has conversed with him in recent years. He is said to be trying to live down his past. End quote. In another 1926 El Paso Herald-Post article it reads, quote, Leland V. Gardner, local Santa Fe officer, believes Billy the Kid, notorious outlaw of pioneer days, still lives, and has thought so for the past 10 years, he said. He is not the El Pasoan, however, who communicated his belief to the New Mexico Historical Society, he declared. That information, said he, had been the Kid about 10 years ago. I am not certain, but I believe I have seen the Kid, said Mr. Gardner. I am told that he is on an isolated ranch within 500 miles of El Paso. When strangers come to the ranch, the Kid disappears until visitors are gone. He was so well known in his day that he can't take any chances on being detected. One thing that leads me to believe the Kid still lives, from what I have read, there was a big standing reward for Billy the Kid, and Sheriff Pat Garrett did not collect the reward after he was supposed to have killed the Kid. The Kid was not an outlaw by choice. The first killing he committed was forced upon him, and after that he was forced to kill in self-defense. End quote. In the June 23, 1926 El Paso Herald it reads, quote, The story that Billy the Kid was not killed by Pat Garrett in 1881, but that he was seen as late as 1910, did not come as a surprise to this section, for old-timers in the Lincoln vicinity have never conceded the Kid's death. George Coe of Glencoe, a side partner of Billy the Kid, and one of 2 remaining survivors of the Kid's faction of the Lincoln County War, has declared many times that he did not believe the Kid was killed. C.C. McNatt of Alamogordo was in the vicinity of Lincoln when the Kid was supposed to have been killed, and he recalls that settlers there at the time doubted the story of the Kid's death. Many believed it was a frame-up between those who wanted the reward and Billy, who had served his purpose in breaking up the cattle ring and was willing to leave. End quote. In the June 22, 1938 edition of the El Paso Herald-Post, it contains the following, quote, Is Billy the Kid, New Mexico's notorious outlaw before the turn of the century, still living? That recurrent question popped up again today with a group of old frontiersmen headed by Major Gordon W. Lilly of Pawnee, Oklahoma, hunting his answer. Billy the Kid, whose 6 guns carved history in the grim Lincoln County War, was trapped and killed by Sheriff Pat Garrett in 1881, according to all known accounts, which have nevertheless been questioned repeatedly. Major Lilly's group, left for Albuquerque, where they planned to question Elfago Baca, territorial gunman and feared peace officer of the old cattle days. With Lily was Eddie Botsford of Littlefield, Texas, the Reverend J.W.E. Airy of Houston, Texas, and B.F. Barbert of Taos, New Mexico. They are members of the National Frontiersmen's Association, which is seeking to verify reports the kid escaped to Mexico instead of falling under Pat Garrett's guns." End quote. In the book, The Kid, Billy the Kid, by Bill Rackesee, it cites a 1950 El Paso Times Around Here column titled, "Is Billy the Kid Still Alive?" by Bill Phillips, which reads, quote, "Billy the Kid is still alive and lives on a ranch 200 miles of El Paso, according to a theory held by some Southwesterners. If this story should by some chance be true, countless tourists may have seen the aging one-time desperado as he trudged innocently along New Mexico roads. And perhaps, someday, an elderly gentleman on his deathbed may reveal he is Billy the Kid. If this should happen, the news will strike the historical world like an atomic bomb, and dozens of books on the frontier's most famous gunmen will have to be rewritten. History today tells us that Billy the Kid, whose blazing guns snuffed out the lives of 21 men, died at the age of 21 in 1881, fatally wounded by Sheriff Pat Garrett in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. But folks who say that Billy the Kid could still be alive tell a different story. They say that Sheriff Garrett never killed the kid. They argue that Garrett was a good friend of the kid's and let him escape from the jail through a prearranged plan shortly before the kid was to be hanged. The kid is then supposed to have ridden by horseback to the home of his sweetheart, Paulita Maxwell, where he met Garrett. A sham gunfight was staged. The kid rode off free, and a fake body representing the remains was buried. According to this version, Billy the Kid lived peaceably afterwards under an assumed name and could still be alive today. Support to some such story has been given by one of the kid's partners, George Coe of Glencoe, who is now dead. Coe declared many times that he did not believe the kid was killed, but if he did possess additional information about the kid, Coe never made it public. "Why," asked Coe and others, "did Garrett fail to collect the $5,000 reward posted for capture of the kid, dead or alive?" Speculation over a possibility that the kid was never killed flamed up in 1926 when an El Paso newspaper reporter told the following story. The reporter was introduced by a governmental official, then under suspicion, to a woman who said she knew where Billy the Kid was living. She told of harboring the kid on her ranch shortly after the famed gunfight with Garrett. Her husband had sent the kid money for years and still corresponded with him, she said. Although she said the kid was living somewhere in New Mexico within 200 miles of El Paso, she declined to give the exact location on grounds that the kid feared revenge from relatives of the men he had killed. She withheld her name in connection with the publication of the story and said her husband would be very angry if he learned about she had given away the secret. The reporter compromised by attributing the account to an anonymous rancher. The story concluded by stating, "But up in little New Mexico villages, you can still find oldsters who shake their heads when asked about the kid's death. They wonder too." End quote. In a June 30th, 1938 El Paso Times article, it reads, quote, "Now that the old controversy about whether Billy the Kid really was killed by Pat Garrett that night in Old Fort Sumner has busted loose again, Mrs. L.A. Cardwell of Las Cruces is reminded of a conversation she had with a little ancient prospector while camping in the Black Range several years ago. Mrs. Cardwell tells it thus. Coming down out of the high mountains one day, one of these typical old-time prospectors following a couple of heavily laden burros stopped at our camp, and having but his pack mules to talk to for many weeks, and since the camp had an ample supply of the makings, he lingered quite a spell. After he had told us of his latest prospects and showed us many of his specimens, we led the conversation on to the early days. His name, he said, was Manuel Taylor. He told us he was born at La Mesilla, and when a young man had moved to Silver City during the chloride flats boom. Speaking of Billy the Kid, Mr. Taylor said, I knew Billy the Kid well when he was at Silver City. We used to run horse races together. In fact, another young fellow and myself once pried the bars off the chimney top at the old adobe jail so that Billy could climb out. The man killed at Maxwell's was a young cattle detective who had come from the east and expecting to make some easy money capturing cattle rustlers and got hit by mistake. Going on with the story, Taylor said, "I was in Guadalajara, Mexico in 1914, where I met the kid. The recognition was mutual, and we had a few drinks together for old time's sake. He had married there and has a family." When asked about the appearance of the kid, Mr. Taylor said, "Of course he is older, but in many respects the same. He still has the buck teeth and grown heavier." Having never before heard this version of the affair, I had Mr. Taylor repeat the story to me. He said he could not be mistaken as to the identity of the man with whom he had took the drinks with in Guadalajara. A few days later, when in Hillsborough, I took the trouble to inquire regarding Mr. Taylor, and was informed that he was well known in that community, and that he was truthful and trustworthy." End quote. In the June 27, 1948 El Paso Times it reads, quote, "According to press reports from Carlsbad, New Mexico, J.W. Weldy, 83-year-old resident of that city, says he talked with Billy in a Las Cruces dry goods store 4 years ago. The kid had been living in Mexico all these years, instead of in a grave in Fort Sumner," Weldy declares. End quote. In the December 1950 edition of Frontier Times is an article titled, "Has Billy the Kid Come Alive?" by Marvin J. Hunter, which states that Hunter saw the kid in 1899 at Clifton, Arizona. Jim Herron was a Texan who met Billy the Kid in 1880 while running cattle between Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Herron would toe the line between outlaw by rustling cattle and lawman, being known as the first sheriff of no man's land in the Oklahoma Panhandle. After being charged with cattle theft, he escaped and left the territory. According to Jim Herron's daughter Rita, he claimed that he saw Billy the Kid several times after he was reportedly killed by Garrett in 1881. He even supports Robert's claim by stating that he ran into him in Mexico while dealing cattle when Roberts said he was there. According to Rita's son-in-law, Melton Haley, in a letter dated April 10, 2006, to Emily Smith, it tells of an interesting encounter he had with his wife Emma and some members of her family at the Billy the Kid Museum in Fort Sumner. It states, quote, "They came over, and being no place to go, took them to Don Sweet's museum. Don was trying to feed one of the men assorted flavors of BS, telling how Billy was buried here, and his dad had the wagon Billy's corpse was taken to Santa Fe to collect reward. He looked Don straight in the eye, and he said, 'That is a lie.' You can imagine the look on Don's face then. Emma had to add fat to the fire and say that her granddad and Billy bought cattle in Mexico and sold in the U.S. long after Billy was said to have been killed. I quickly ushered them out. I told her when I took them up to Boland's place and they saw a pile of dirt with a tombstone not to laugh out loud or say anything, as I had to live here." End quote. In a letter dated January 17, 2006, from Melton Haley to Emily Smith, he writes, quote, "I am 77 now, and when I was in my late 20s, I was working near Superior, Arizona, and became acquainted with Rita McGrew, who was in her mid-80s. She often spoke of her father, Jim Herron, and William Bonney dealing in cattle together, which would have been long after Billy was to have been killed. The author of the book, The Alhoot Trail, interviewed Rita and others of the area. Actually, Billy the Kid was of little interest to anyone in that area, as quite a number of people with a dark past moved to Arizona, and some became the pillars of the community." End quote. In a letter dated March 13, 2006, from Melton Haley to Emily Smith, it reads, quote, "I have hesitated to speak of this because of the religious bigots that promote untruths about Billy the Kid for money, Fort Sumner. I have been threatened several times because I will not promote false stories. As you well know, Billy met Jim in what is now Oklahoma, and they lived in southern Arizona and Mexico. I knew Rita McGrew quite well for a number of years, who was a daughter of Jim Herron. I was married to her daughter Emma. She and I knew each other for years. I doubt if I ever heard of Billy before Rita told me about her dad and Billy. I know nothing about Brushy Bill other than what I have read, but by what Rita told me, I would bet Brushy Bill is indeed Billy the Kid." End quote. According to William V. Morrison, Roberts met up with his old friend Tom Pickett, who rode with Billy and was captured with the kid by Garrett and his posse at Stinking Springs in December of 1880. In a letter dated May 31, 1964, from William V. Morrison to Paul Roberts, it reads, quote, "My research extends to Prescott, St. John's, Show Low, etc., as our client Billy Roberts visited that country with Tom Pickett in the 1890s after Garrett claimed he had shot the kid in New Mexico. I was attempting to locate witnesses to testify in court that they knew Brushy Bill Roberts was Billy the Kid in New Mexico. I knew that Tom Pickett would be a witness if still living." End quote. According to Morrison, he was able to confirm this in interviews with Pickett's niece and nephew, who he interviewed in La Mesa, Texas. In a letter dated November 29, 1950, from Ray Leger to the law firm of Andrus, Lipscomb and Pennycollis, it reads, quote, "My grandfather, Mr. Seferino Romero, formerly of Colonias, New Mexico, has become very interested in the developments of the case of Billy the Kid. He knew the kid very well and has reasons to believe he was not killed by Pat Garrett, but fled the country. Mr. Romero feels confident that he can determine whether this man you represent is Billy the Kid, if given a chance to talk to him. He would like to offer his services if they can be of help in proving that your client is his old friend." End quote. In a December 4, 1950 letter from William V. Morrison to Ray Leger, Morrison responded by stating, quote, "I am sorry that I did not learn about your grandfather while we were visiting at Las Vegas during the month of July. Billy and this writer visited there in an endeavor to locate persons who might be able to identify Billy. I shall be pleased to hear anything that your grandfather remembers about the kid." End quote. In a follow-up letter, dated June 21, 1951, Morrison offers to visit with Romero and play some of his tape-recorded interviews with Roberts to see if he recognizes Roberts' voice as being the kid's. In the book, alias Billy the Kid, by William V. Morrison and C.L. Saunderson, it cites a letter dated March 28, 1950, from Arthur Hyde to William V. Morrison. According to Mr. Arthur Hyde of the Veterans Hospital at Whipple, Arizona, in 1914, he visited with a Mr. Goforth, a relative who had lived at the head of the Mimbres River since 1900. He was sent to visit a friend, an old-timer named Thompson, who had resided in Sacramento County for many years. When the subject of Billy the Kid came up, Thompson was convinced that Garrett and Billy cooked up a plan to make it look as though Garrett had lived up to his campaign promise to exterminate the kid. A Mexican boy turned up, and that bore a strong resemblance to the kid and was used as a substitute. Garrett told the young boy to go to the Maxwell house where he could meet a rancher who might give him a job. The rest of the episode went off just as it had been written, over and time again. They had a quiet burial on the grounds, lest some of his followers might cause trouble, and the casket was not opened at the burial. Mr. Thompson stated that he heard that Billy went to the state of Chihuahua, Mexico, and went into ranching. As it happened, I got TB in the service and was sent to the old Army hospital at Fort Bayard, near Silver City, New Mexico, for treatment. After I got discharged early in 1920, I spent the next 4 years rambling around the Mongoloons and the Black Range. I met up with several old-timers who told me just about the same story. Among them was J.E. George, now dead, at Mule Creek, and a Bill Jones, also dead, at Reserve, New Mexico. They all told me it was a case of dirty rotten politics, and Billy just happened to serve their purpose. They didn't seem to consider the killing of the innocent Mexican of any importance. Judging from what they told me, it was common knowledge among those who were on the inside at the time." End quote. In a letter dated August 27, 1990, from James Anthony to William A. Tunstall, it revealed the following information as related to William Roberts. Quote, "I am writing in regards to an incident which happened in Hyco, Texas in 1945, to which I was an eyewitness. My name is James Anthony, and my grandfather, Harry H. Anthony, was a one-time Pinkerton detective for the railroad and later an undercover federal marshal. At this time, he was in his 80s, but still very sharp in mind and body. We'd went to Archer City and talked him into moving to Hyco, where my dad owned a farm and we built him a cabin about a half-mile from our house. At this time, I was about 15 years old and scared to death of him. We, meaning Dad, Grandpa, me, and my 2 younger brothers, had went to town to buy flour and beans and get a haircut. We were standing outside the barber shop on a bench when we noticed this old man walking towards us, which to me could have almost been my granddad's twin. They were dressed about the same way and had the same long beard and long white hair. The closer he got, the more he looked at Granddad, and my granddad got real nervous, like he did when he was mad. He always wore his gun, a big .45, in a shoulder holster under his jacket. When Brushy Bill got about 15 feet from us, my granddad jumped up and hollered, "Bonnie, don't reach for it. You're under arrest." Daddy grabbed Grandpa and said, "What's the matter with you? You don't know this man." He told my dad to get out of his way, and I think his exact words were, "I'd know that son of a bitch Will Bonnie anywhere. Ask him if I wouldn't." Then Brushy Bill turned and ran back down the street, and they held my grandpa. My grandpa kept saying that he was Billy the Kid till he died. He kept on at the people of Hyco until they got up a petition to take Grandpa's gun. Houston White was the sheriff of Hamilton County at that time and was afraid of no one. I was there when he came to get Grandpa's guns. He got about 30 feet from Grandpa's cabin, and Granddad told him to stop. He knew what he wanted, and he wanted to show identification proving he was a federal marshal, but he was not giving up his gun to no one, and that he could identify Billy the Kid, and was going to arrest him with or without his help. White told him to come out and talk and identify himself. He showed him some papers, and they walked down the road a little way and talked a little while, or rather, a long time. Then, White got in his car and drove off. White later became a Texas Ranger. Grandpa sat and told me many a time that he knew him from the ranch wars and that it was Billy. He believed that till the day he died, and I still believe it with all my heart. Grandpa was as sharp as a young man was. I was as scared that day as I ever have been, and Grandpa meant to kill him." End quote. James Anthony would also sign a sworn affidavit affirming this account. The affidavit appears in Billy the Kid, Killed in New Mexico, Died in Texas by Dr. Janae P. Valdez and Judge Bobby E. Hefner. In the book, The Hyco Legend of Billy the Kid, by Judge Bob Hefner, it cites the findings of C.S. Holmes of Clovis, New Mexico, who in the 1960s discovered a copy of an old grand jury indictment in Seymour, Texas. The indictment, filed in Hardeman County, Texas, on December 28, 1881, for the charge of murder. One of the witnesses to the killing named in the indictment was Billy the Kid. To quote Judge Hefner, quote, "Either someone else was using the name Billy the Kid, or Pat Garrett shot someone else that historical night." End quote. In the book, Billy the Kid and Me Were the Same, by William A. Tunstall, it cites another legal document that proves that the territory of New Mexico was still seeking the kid's capture after he was reportedly killed. On December 20th, 1882, San Miguel County issued a warrant and indictment for the arrest of Billy the Kid, indictment number 1473 by the District Court of San Miguel County, proving that many law enforcement officials did not believe that he was killed in 1881. This same indictment was reissued on March 5th, 1883, and was returned both times as not found in the county. This same indictment was also cited in Billy the Kid, Killed in New Mexico, Died in Texas by Dr. Janae P. Valdez and Judge Bobby E. Hefner. According to an article appearing in the Santa Rosa News in 1960, Samuel G. Pendergrass interviewed Bob Young of Abilene, Texas, who stated that he had known Uncle Jimmy McDaniels at Round Rock for years. According to Mr. Young, James McDaniels was approximately 70 years of age in 1930, 6 feet 2 inches tall, weighing about 175 pounds, and lived alone. During his interview with the Santa Rosa News, Mr. Young was able to recount a very interesting story involving Jim McDaniels and Brushy Bill Roberts. He stated, quote, "I first met Brushy Bill in Homer Thompson's barber shop, a couple of doors up the street from our garage. There was something about the old man, a seeming loneliness, a distant faraway look in his eyes that immediately drew my sympathy. It was nearing Thanksgiving at the time, and a turkey processing plant in Comanche was in full operation, picking and dressing birds for the oncoming holidays. A larger number of men and women was employed in the plant during the peak season, and it was there that Brushy Bill was working when I met him. He came into the barber shop while I was waiting for a haircut. He was dressed in old, blood-stained overalls, and he presented a strange, gory sight in the cozy little shop. I think the general feeling around Comanche was that Brushy Bill didn't have particularly good sense. This didn't spring from any specific information about the old man, but merely from the fact that he stayed away from others a great deal, and spent most of his free time shuffling around in the distant pasture land ringing Comanche. He was married to a heavy-set woman, slightly younger than himself. I didn't know her well, since she didn't circulate much, was sick much of the time, I believe. She seemed rather insignificant. They lived in a portion of Comanche dubbed Donkey Flat, which suggests the character of the area. They were newcomers to Comanche. I know because I have lived there twice before, and I hadn't known them. I would say Brushy Bill was in his middle 70s when I met him in 1930, but he seemed in excellent health and had the carriage of a much younger man. I never saw him slouch, always carrying his shoulders erect as if he were marching. He had funny-looking eyes that were sort of speckled gray, and the thing I remember most distinctly was his large left ear, of the type we used to call a flop ear. It stood out from his head, and the top of it flopped down a bit, making it seem bigger than it was. For some reason, possibly because I was always courteous to him, a matter of my early training, the old man took a liking to me. He would spend hours in the garage on slack days, passing the time of day. But I realize now that Brushy Bill actually told me very little about himself. One day, though, I happened to mention that I had lived in Round Rock as a child, and that my family still lived in Austin. Brushy Bill showed immediate interest, questioning me at length about my friends in Round Rock. Finally, he took me into his confidence, saying he could trust me. He continued, "I wonder," he said finally, "when you'll be going to Round Rock again." "Well, I don't know," I said. "I go through there every time I drive to Austin." Then a thought occurred to me, and I asked, "Would you like to make the trip sometime?" His old eyes brightened, and he grinned happily. "I sure would," he said. I said I'd let him know the next time I was making the trip. As it happened, not long after that, I was able to get away from the garage for a weekend, and I made plans to visit the family in Austin. The night before I left, I drove out to Brushy Bill's shack. He greeted me with a worried look on his face. "Mr. Roberts," I said, "I thought you'd like to know I'll be driving to Round Rock tomorrow. Want to go along?" He thought for a moment, then sighed heavily. "Sorry, Bob, but I can't this time. Wife's sick, awful sick, and I just can't leave her now." I said I was sorry and that I hoped his wife got better. Then I prepared to leave. Bob?" he asked hesitantly, with that look of longing creeping back into his wrinkled face. "Do you know a man by the name of Jim McDaniels in Round Rock?" "Why, yes," I said. "I know Mr. McDaniels well. Ever see him?" "Why, yes. I make it a point to see him when I'm in Round Rock." Brushy Bill fixed those speckled eyes on me again. I've never seen eyes quite like those on any other man, and he looked at me cautiously. "Do something for me, Bob." "Sure, glad to." "If you see Jimmy McDaniel, would you do this for me? Just tell him you saw the kid last night, and the kid said to tell him hello." "Why, of course I will," I said, "and I'm sure he'll be happy to hear from you." That was all there was to it. Brushy Bill didn't explain the message, and as a matter of fact, it needed no explanation. It seemed perfectly natural for an old man to send a message to a friend of his younger days. I drove out to Mr. McDaniel's the first thing when I got to Round Rock. The old man was seated on the porch of the modest frame house on the edge of Round Rock. He rose to greet me. His hair was dark, thickly laced with gray, and now receding from his ample forehead. The long face was highlighted by a prominent chin, and he had large ears. "Mr. McDaniels," I said, after the greetings were done, "I've got a message from an old friend of yours." "Who's that, boy?" he asked, eyes a twinkle. "Well," I said, "I saw the kid last night, and he said for me to tell you hello." I was completely unprepared for Mr. McDaniel's reaction to the simple message. He blinked his watery eyes and looked as if I had brought some shocking news. "What did you say?" I repeated patiently, thinking he had misunderstood. "I saw the kid last night, and he said to tell you hello." I've never seen such a transformation in a man's face. His robust old face blanched to a whitewash hue, and his frame shook like a palsied child. "Why, sir," I said, "are you all right?" He couldn't even answer. I could do nothing but help him back into his chair on the porch. After a while, he calmed down, and I took my leave of him, puzzled. I remained puzzled until I picked up a copy of Alias Billy the Kid by Sonderson and Morrison. On page 21 of the book, there are these words from Roberts, quote, "Rode back to Messia that summer of '77, met Jimmy McDaniels," end quote. The article was originally cited in the Heiko Legend of Billy the Kid by Judge Bob Hefner. In the book, The Return of the Outlaw Billy the Kid by W.C. Jameson and Frederick Bean, it tells of an incident involving Brushy Bill Roberts that was witnessed by a man by the name of Alton Thornton, which reads, quote, "Roberts was walking along a Heiko, Texas sidewalk one afternoon on his way to the post office. On the other side of the street, a mother and her young son, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, were heading in the opposite direction. The child suddenly ran out into the street in front of an oncoming car, and the frightened mother screamed, 'Billy!' Observers noted that Roberts, startled upon hearing the shouted name, turned sharply and reached for an imaginary gun. Eventually, determining that it was not he that was being called, he hurried on his way." End quote. The following notice was dated and posted more than 8 months after Billy the Kid was purportedly shot and killed by Pat Garrett. Quote, "Notice to thieves, thugs, fakers, and bunco steerers, among who are J.J. Harlan, alias Off-Wheeler, Sawdust Charlie, William Hedges, Billy the Kid, Billy Mullen, Little Jack, the Cutter, Pockmarked Kid, and about 20 others. If found within the limits of this city after 10 o'clock p.m. this night, you will be invited to attend a grand necktie party, the expense of which will be borne by 100 substantial citizens." End quote. This notice was posted at Las Vegas on March 24, 1882. According to author Janae P. Valdez, quote, "The citizens of Las Vegas must have known that Billy the Kid was really still alive, or they wouldn't have put Billy's name on the poster. There was only one real Billy the Kid." End quote. While many of the facts are confused in these testimonials, the fact remains that the word was out that Garrett did not kill Billy the Kid, and proves that statements made by those that oppose Roberts' claim that no sightings or accounts of Billy existed following his purported killing in 1881 are not correct. I am currently in the process of finishing my next 2 videos and should have them up pretty quickly. I will be presenting the next chapter of Brushy Bill Roberts in his own words, his life after the shooting at Fort Sumner, and I will also be narrating the episode that my late friend Dr. Janae P. Valdez wrote, detailing his research on the shooting at Fort Sumner. I hope to have the next video up in about a week, with the other following about a week after that. Let me end this by saying, if you enjoy my videos and want to help grow my channel, you can do so by liking and subscribing. With that said, I'll be back real soon with the next video. Until then, stay tuned, and thank you for watching.